The lawyer's voice cracked like a whip across the silent room. 30 days, Mr. Pruitt repeated, adjusting his spectacles as though the words might change if he looked at them again. Miss Eleanor Hartwell shall inherit the full Hartwell estate, its lands and its accounts, on the condition that she is married within 30 days of this reading. Should she fail to meet this condition, the entirety of the estate shall pass to her cousin, Mr. Edmund Hartwell. Eleanor sat very still in her black morning dress, her gloved hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles ached. Across the room, Edmund did not bother to hide his smile. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the armrest, watching her the way a man watches a fire he expects to burn out on its own. 30 days, Edmund said softly, almost kindly, though there was nothing kind in his eyes. That does not seem like very long, does it, cousin? Eleanor did not look at him. She looked at Mr. Pruitt instead, searching his tired face for some sign that he might have misread the will, that her grandfather's final act had not been to hand her future to a man who had wanted this house long before he had ever wanted her ruin. There must be some mistake, she said. Her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. Mr. Pruitt shook his head slowly. I am afraid not, Miss Hartwell. Your grandfather was very clear on this point. He believed a woman alone could not hold this estate against the kind of pressure that would come for it. He wished to see you settled and safe before he was gone. Settled, Eleanor repeated, and the word tasted bitter. Safe, as if a rushed marriage to a man she did not love could ever be called safe. Her mother, Charlotte Hartwell, sat beside her, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She had not spoken since the reading began. Eleanor knew why. If the estate passed to Edmund, her mother would lose the only home she had left, the small cottage on the grounds where she had lived since Eleanor's father died. Edmund rose from his chair, smoothing his coat with unhurried fingers. I do hope you find someone in time, cousin, he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the whole room to hear, though I confess, I cannot think of a single gentleman in London desperate enough to marry a woman under such conditions. Men do talk, you know, and they do not care for being made a convenience. Get out, Eleanor said quietly. Edmund only smiled wider and gave a small bow before he left, his footsteps unhurried on the polished floor, as though he already owned it. The moment the door closed behind him, Charlotte finally broke. Eleanor, what are we going to do? 30 days. 30 days is nothing. It took your father 4 months simply to court me before he ever proposed. We are not going to panic, Eleanor said, though her heart was pounding so hard she feared her mother might hear it. There must be a way. A way to fall in love in 30 days? Charlotte asked, her voice rising with disbelief. Not love, Eleanor said. The word came out steadier than she expected. A way to marry. Charlotte stared at her daughter as though she had never truly seen her before. You cannot mean to marry a stranger. I mean to keep this house, Eleanor said. I mean to keep you in your home, and I mean to see Edmund's face when he realizes he is lost. If that requires a marriage of convenience, then so be it. Mr. Pruitt cleared his throat gently from behind his desk, and Eleanor turned to him, grateful for any distraction from the fear building in her chest. Miss Hartwell, he said carefully, if I may, there is a gentleman in London who might suit such an arrangement. I do not say this lightly, and I would not suggest it if your circumstances were not so pressing. Who? The Duke of Frostmere. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor had heard of him, of course. Everyone in London had heard of the Duke of Frostmere, though few had ever spoken to him directly. He was said to be the coldest man in the city, a widower who had shut his doors to society 3 years ago and had not opened them since. Some called him heartless. Others simply called him gone, as though whatever had once lived behind his eyes had left the day his wife did. They call him Frostmere for a reason, Mr. Pruitt, Eleanor said carefully. I do not think a man like that would agree to marry anyone, let alone a stranger with 30 days and a desperate need. Perhaps not for love, Mr. Pruitt agreed, but I have heard, through channels that are not entirely proper for me to name, that his estate is not in the condition his title suggests. He has debts, Miss Hartwell, significant ones, and your family's shipping interests are worth a great deal to a man who needs capital quickly and quietly. Eleanor sat with that for a long moment. A marriage built on nothing but numbers and need, no courtship, no affection. Only 2 people who required something from each other and were willing to sign their names to get it. It should have frightened her more than it did. Arrange a meeting, she said. Charlotte gasped. Eleanor, you cannot be serious. The man is a stranger. Worse than a stranger, from what they say of him. I do not need him to love me, mother, Eleanor said, standing and smoothing the front of her morning dress. I need him to sign a contract, That is all this will require." But even as she said the words, something in her chest tightened, some small, stubborn part of her that did not quite believe what she was telling herself. Mr. Pruitt agreed to send word to Frostmere's household that afternoon, though he warned her plainly that the Duke rarely accepted invitations, and answered even fewer letters. Eleanor thanked him, and left the office with her mother trailing behind her, still murmuring protests that grew quieter with every step, as though she too understood there was no other path forward. Outside, the London afternoon was gray and damp, carriages rattling over wet cobblestones, the smell of coal smoke thick in the air. Eleanor stood on the step for a moment, letting the cold settle into her skin, trying to steady the storm inside her. 30 days. She thought of her grandfather, of the warmth in his hands when he used to walk her through the gardens as a child, naming every flower as though it mattered as much as any lesson in a schoolroom. She could not understand why a man so gentle in life had left her such a cruel test in death. Perhaps he had believed he was protecting her. Perhaps he had simply run out of time to explain himself before the illness took him. Either way, the result was the same. She had 30 days, one desperate plan, and a man the whole of London called too cold to want anything at all. A carriage rolled past, and for a moment, Eleanor caught sight of her own reflection in its polished window. She barely recognized herself. The girl who had once laughed easily at her grandfather's jokes now looked back at her with hollow eyes and a jaw set too tight for comfort. Grief had changed her face in ways she had not noticed until now. "Eleanor," her mother said gently, coming to stand beside her on the step. "Are you certain about this? There may be other gentlemen, men who are not so cold, who might come to care for you in time." "There is no time, Mother," Eleanor said. "That is the entire trouble. A courtship takes months. I have days. Whoever agrees to this will need to see it as a bargain, not a romance, or he will not agree to it at all before the deadline passes us by." Charlotte's eyes filled again, though she blinked the tears back with the same quiet strength Eleanor had always admired in her. "Your grandfather loved you very much. I have to believe that. Whatever this will has done to us, I cannot believe he meant it as cruelty." "I know," Eleanor said softly, though the ache in her chest did not lessen for knowing it. "I only wish he had trusted me to manage on my own, rather than deciding I needed a husband to do it for me." They walked home in silence after that, the city closing in around them with its noise and its smoke and its endless indifferent crowds. Eleanor kept turning the name over in her mind, the Duke of Frostmere. She had seen him once, years ago, at a ball she barely remembered, a tall figure standing apart from the dancing with a glass he never seemed to drink from. Even then, before his wife's passing, before the rumors and the silence, there had been something distant about him, as if he were always watching a door that no one else could see. She wondered what kind of man agreed to marry for money and land instead of affection. She wondered, too, what kind of woman she had become, that she was willing to ask him. That evening, a letter arrived at the Hartwell townhouse, delivered by a servant in dark green livery who did not wait for a reply. Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers and read the single line written inside. "I will see her Thursday, at 4, Frostmere House, alone." No greeting, no signature beyond the initial J, sharp and slanted, as though even his handwriting resented the effort of forming words. Eleanor read it twice, then a third time, searching for some warmth hidden between the lines and finding none. She folded the letter carefully and pressed it flat against her palm. Thursday, 4 days from now, 26 days left after that to secure a wedding, a contract, and a future she could not yet imagine. She did not know, standing there in the dim light of the front hall with her mother's worried eyes on her back, that the man she was about to meet had buried more than a wife 3 years ago. She did not know that his silence was not simply coldness, but the only wall he had left standing between himself and a grief he had never once spoken aloud. She only knew that she had 4 days to prepare herself to walk into Frostmere House and ask a stranger to marry her, and that whatever happened on Thursday would decide the rest of her life. She went to bed that night with the letter still in her hand, and she did not sleep. The doors of Frostmere House opened before Eleanor could even lift her hand to knock, as though someone inside had been watching the street and counting the minutes until 4 o'clock arrived. A butler with a stern face and silver hair led her through a hallway so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. No portraits lined the walls here, unlike every other great house she had visited. No flowers stood in the vases. The rooms she passed were clean, well kept, and utterly empty of warmth, as if the house itself had learned to hold its breath. "His Grace will see you in the study," the butler said, and opened a heavy door without knocking. The Duke of Frostmere stood by the window with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. dressed in dark clothes that made him look carved out of the gray afternoon light. He did not turn immediately, and Eleanor was left standing in the doorway, unsure whether to speak first or wait for some acknowledgement that never seemed to come. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, still facing the window. His voice was low and even, without any trace of welcome in it. "You have 30 days, I understand. 26 now, I believe, since we are wasting one on pleasantries neither of us wants." "You are well informed," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady, though her pulse was racing. "London is a small city when it comes to gossip." He turned then, and Eleanor found herself facing a man whose eyes were the pale gray of winter sky, sharp and unreadable, set into a face that might have been handsome if it had ever allowed itself to soften. "Sit, if you like, though I suspect you did not come here for comfort." She did not sit. "I came here for an arrangement, Your Grace. I understand that may suit you as well as it suits me." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. Direct. "I did not expect that. I do not have time to be anything else." He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them until it felt like its own kind of conversation. Then he crossed the room and gestured to a chair near the cold, unlit fireplace. This time Eleanor sat, and he took the seat across from her, folding one leg over the other with the ease of a man used to controlling every room he entered. "Tell me what you propose," he said. "Precisely. I have little patience for vague arrangements." Eleanor drew a breath and began, laying out the terms she had spent the last 4 days rehearsing in her mind until they no longer sounded desperate to her own ears. A marriage in name, conducted quickly and quietly. Her family's shipping interests placed under joint control, with the profits divided in a manner they would agree upon by contract. No expectation of affection. No expectation of anything beyond what two reasonable people required of each other to solve two separate problems. The Duke listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away, his gray eyes fixed on her the entire time as though he were reading something written beneath her words rather than the words themselves. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You have done your research," he said finally. "My debts are not public knowledge, Miss Hartwell, not truly. How did you come by them?" "Mr. Pruitt has connections that are not entirely proper for a solicitor to have," Eleanor said. "I did not ask too many questions about how he learned what he learned." The faintest suggestion of something that might have been amusement crossed the Duke's face before it vanished again. "Practical. I admire that, even if I do not admire the method. Then you will consider it?" "I have already considered it," he said. "You would not be sitting in this room otherwise. I do not entertain guests I have no intention of speaking business with." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, though she did not let it show on her face. "Then we are agreed." "Not yet." He rose from his chair and walked back to the window, looking out at the gray gardens beyond the glass. Gardens that, like everything else in the house, seemed to have given up trying to be beautiful. "I have conditions of my own, Miss Hartwell, and you will hear them before you decide whether this arrangement suits you as well as you believe it does." "Go on." "I will not pretend affection I do not feel," he said, his voice flat and final. "You will not expect it from me, not in public and certainly not in private. This house will remain as it is. I do not wish for it to be filled with guests, with noise, with the sort of life that other marriages seem to require. You may have your own rooms, your own habits, your own life within reason, provided it does not interfere with the terms of our contract." "And what of children?" Eleanor asked, because the question needed asking, however uncomfortable it made the room feel. The Duke's jaw tightened, just slightly, the first true crack she had seen in his composure since she arrived. "That is a conversation for another day, if it becomes necessary at all. I would ask you not to press the matter further today." Eleanor nodded, sensing there was a wound beneath that answer she was not meant to touch. Not yet, perhaps not ever. "I can agree to your conditions," she said. "Provided you agree to mine, my mother remains in her cottage on the estate grounds, regardless of what happens between us in the future. That is not negotiable." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation, and something about the speed of his answer surprised her. She had expected him to argue every point, to extract every advantage a man in his position might reasonably extract from a woman as desperate as she was. Instead, he simply agreed, as if her mother's security cost him nothing at all to grant. "Then we have an arrangement," Eleanor said. "We have the beginning of one." The Duke turned from the window and studied her again, that same unreadable weight in his gaze. "I will have my solicitor draft the contract. You will review it with Mr. Pruitt before you sign anything. I do not want it said that I forced a woman into terms she did not understand. That is more consideration than I expected from you, Your Grace. Do not mistake it for kindness," he said. I simply do not care to have my name associated with scandal any more than it already is. A woman coerced into marriage would draw far more attention than a woman who chose it freely, however unusual her reasons. Eleanor rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts, feeling strangely steadier than she had upon arriving. When shall the wedding take place? As soon as the contract is signed and the necessary arrangements are made. A week, perhaps less. I see no reason to delay something neither of us wishes to prolong. A week, Eleanor repeated. It sounded impossibly fast, and at the same time, not fast enough. Not with 26 days already narrowing toward 20. The Duke walked her to the study door himself, which she had not expected, and as he opened it, he paused, looking at her with an expression she could not quite place. May I ask you something, Miss Hartwell? Of course. Why did you not simply choose a man who might love you? There are gentlemen enough in London who would marry quickly for a fortune and a pretty face, and who would at least pretend at warmth while doing it. Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. Because pretending would be worse than honesty, Your Grace. I would rather marry a man who tells me plainly he feels nothing, than one who lies to my face about feeling everything. Something shifted in the Duke's expression then, something Eleanor could not name, gone as quickly as it appeared. That is either very wise or very foolish. I have not yet decided which. Perhaps it is both, Eleanor said, and for the first time since she had entered Frostmere House, she thought she saw the ghost of something like respect in his cold gray eyes. She left the house with the wind biting at her cheeks and her heart pounding in a way she could not entirely explain. The arrangement was settled, the terms were fair, and yet something about the Duke of Frostmere had unsettled her more deeply than she wanted to admit. Some crack beneath his ice she had glimpsed for only a moment, before he sealed it shut again. She did not know yet what had put that ice there. She only knew that whatever it was, it ran far deeper than debts or duty, and that she had just agreed to spend the rest of her life beside a man who guarded his grief the way other men guarded gold. 26 days remained. She intended to use every one of them wisely. When Eleanor returned home, her mother was waiting in the front parlor, seated stiffly on the edge of the settee as though she had not moved since Eleanor left that afternoon. Charlotte rose the moment the door opened, her hands twisting together in her lap, forgotten in her haste. Well, Charlotte asked, what is he like? Did he agree? He agreed, Eleanor said, removing her gloves finger by finger, buying herself a moment to find the right words. He is not what I expected. Cold, as they say. Cold, Eleanor admitted. But not cruel. There is a difference, Mother, though I could not have told you that before today. She sat across from her mother and recounted the meeting as plainly as she could, the terms, the conditions, the strange moment at the door when he had asked her why she had chosen him at all. Charlotte listened with a frown deepening on her face. A week, Eleanor. You will be married to a stranger within a week. I know. And you are at peace with that? Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. I am at peace with keeping this house. I am at peace with keeping you safe in your cottage, and with denying Edmund the satisfaction of watching us lose everything grandfather built. Whether I am at peace with the marriage itself, I suppose I will learn in time. Charlotte reached across and took her daughter's hand, her grip firm despite the worry still etched across her face. You have always been braver than I was at your age. I only wish this bravery had not been forced upon you by a man's will and a cousin's greed. So do I, Eleanor said softly. But wishing will not undo the will, and it will not soften Edmund's ambitions. All that is left to me now is to make the best of the path in front of me. 3 days later, Mr. Pruitt arrived at the townhouse with a thick folder of papers under his arm, his expression grave as he laid the contract out across the dining table for Eleanor to review. She read every line twice, sometimes 3 times, though the language was dense with the sort of legal phrasing that made her head ache after the first hour. It is a fair contract, Mr. Pruitt said finally, when she looked up from the final page. More than fair, if I am honest. His Grace's solicitor did not press for advantages I would have expected a man in his position to demand. Your mother's security, your own personal allowance, the division of profits from the shipping interests, all of it favors you more than it favors him. Why would he do that? Eleanor asked, half to herself. Perhaps he simply wants the arrangement settled quickly and without dispute, Mr. Pruitt offered. A contested contract would only delay the very thing he needs most urgently, which is capital. Or perhaps, he added, folding his hands atop the papers, he is not quite the man his reputation suggests. Eleanor thought of the crack she had glimpsed in his composure when she asked about children, the swiftness of his agreement regarding her mother's cottage, the strange, quiet weight in his gray eyes when he had asked why she had not chosen a man who might love her. Perhaps not, she said quietly, and signed her name at the bottom of the page before she could think better of it. That evening, as the ink dried on a contract that would bind her to a stranger within the week, Eleanor sat by her window and watched the last light fade from the London sky. She thought of her grandfather's gentle hands guiding her through the garden, of the flowers he had once named as carefully as if they were his own children, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether he had somehow known what kind of man the Duke of Frostmere truly was beneath the ice, and whether this impossible will had been less a punishment than a chance he was giving her, however strange the shape of it turned out to be. She did not have an answer. She only had 23 days left and a wedding to prepare for. The chapel doors slammed open before the ceremony even began, and Eleanor's stomach dropped the moment she saw Edmund standing in the entryway, his coat still damp from the rain, his eyes gleaming with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had arrived just in time to ruin something. "I did wonder if you would truly go through with it," Edmund said, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the small private chapel. Only a handful of witnesses had been gathered, exactly as the Duke had wanted, and every one of them turned now to stare at the uninvited guest standing in the doorway. "You were not invited, Edmund," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level though her heart was pounding. "No," Edmund agreed, stepping further inside, his boots echoing against the stone floor, "but I could hardly miss the chance to see my cousin marry a man half of London calls a ghost. Tell me, Eleanor, does he speak at all, or does he simply stand there like a statue while you say your vows to the air?" The Duke of Frostmere, who had been standing at the front of the chapel in dark formal dress, turned slowly. His expression did not change, but something in the air around him did, a stillness that felt suddenly dangerous rather than empty. "You must be the cousin," the Duke said, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the small space. "Edmund Hartwell, I believe." "I am," Edmund said, straightening under the weight of that gray gaze despite himself. "Then you should know," the Duke continued, walking a few slow steps down the aisle toward him, "that I did not travel here today to entertain interruptions from a man who lost this house not by misfortune, but by his own uncle's clear judgment of his character. Your grandfather knew precisely what he was protecting Eleanor from when he wrote that will. I have read enough of your reputation in the clubs of London to understand his reasoning entirely." Edmund's smile faltered for the first time. "I do not believe this concerns you, Your Grace." "It concerns me a great deal," the Duke said, his voice never rising, never losing its terrible calm. "You are speaking of my wife, and this is my wedding. I would ask you to leave before I decide that courtesy is no longer required of me." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Edmund glanced around the chapel, at the small gathering of witnesses watching him with open disapproval, and seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that he had misjudged the man standing before him. Whatever coldness London whispered about the Duke of Frostmere, there was nothing weak in it, nothing that could be easily provoked or dismissed. "Enjoy your marriage of convenience," Edmund said finally, forcing his smile back into place, though it no longer reached his eyes. "I am certain it will bring you both great warmth." He turned and left, his footsteps echoing until the heavy chapel doors closed behind him, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. Eleanor found herself staring at the Duke, who had already turned back toward the altar as though nothing at all had happened, his composure settling back over him like a cloak. But she had seen it, that flash of something fierce and immediate in his defense of her, and she could not quite convince herself it had been only duty. "Thank you," she said softly, moving to stand beside him. Her mother approached from the front pew, her handkerchief still pressed to the corner of her eye, though whether from the earlier confrontation or the weight of the occasion itself, Eleanor could not say. Charlotte reached for her daughter's hand and pressed it warmly between both of hers. "I wish your grandfather could see this," Charlotte whispered. "Whatever else is true of this arrangement, you are not facing it alone. That is more than I feared for you a week ago." "I am not certain what I am facing yet, Mother," Eleanor admitted quietly, though she squeezed her mother's hand in return. "But I am grateful you are here." The Duke stood a small distance apart during this exchange, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the two women with an expression that was difficult to place, something between patience and a careful, deliberate distance, as though he did not wish to intrude on a moment that was not his to share. When Charlotte finally released her daughter's hand and stepped back to her seat, he inclined his head toward Eleanor. "I do not tolerate rudeness in my own home, or at my own wedding," he said simply, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than the explanation required. "Shall we continue, Miss Hartwell, or would you prefer more delays?" "No more delays," Eleanor said. "I have had enough of those to last a lifetime." The ceremony itself was brief, almost startlingly so, conducted by a clergyman, who seemed accustomed to hurried arrangements, and asked no questions about the absence of family beyond Eleanor's mother, who stood near the front, dabbing quietly at her eyes. The Duke's vows were spoken clearly, without hesitation, though there was no warmth in them, only the steady precision of a man keeping his word. Eleanor's own voice trembled only slightly as she spoke hers, surprised to find that some small part of her meant them more than she had expected to. When the clergyman pronounced them married, there was no kiss, no embrace, only a brief, formal nod between them, and Eleanor felt the strangeness of it settle over her like a fog. She was a wife now, a duchess, bound by law and contract to a man she had known for less than 2 weeks. Afterward, there was no wedding breakfast, no celebration of any kind. The small gathering dispersed quickly into the gray afternoon, and Eleanor found herself alone with her new husband in a carriage bound for his townhouse in London, the countryside estate of Frostmere still days away. They rode in silence for a long while, the city passing by outside the windows, until Eleanor could no longer bear the quiet pressing in on her. "Why did you defend me, back at the chapel?" she asked. "You could have let him say his piece and leave. It would have cost you nothing." The Duke did not look at her immediately, his gaze fixed on the passing streets. "I do not like men who prey on the vulnerable," he said finally. "Your cousin has spent this entire ordeal treating your desperation as entertainment. I found that I could not stand to watch it continue, contract or no contract." "That sounds like more than indifference to me, Your Grace." "Perhaps," he said, and offered nothing further, though Eleanor noticed the faint tightening at the corner of his jaw, as though he too was surprised by his own reaction. "You may call me Julian," he said after a long silence, still not looking at her. "If we are to share a house, a title, and now a name, I see no reason to maintain such formality between us in private." "Julian," Eleanor repeated, testing the shape of it. "Then you must call me Eleanor." He nodded once, and the silence that followed felt different than before, less like the absence of conversation, and more like the beginning of one that neither of them yet knew how to have. "May I ask you something else?" Eleanor said, watching the rooftops of London slide past the window. "How did you come to owe such debts, if you do not mind my asking? A duke's estate is not usually so fragile." Julian's jaw tightened, though he did not turn from the window. "My father was not a careful man with money, and I was not paying enough attention in the years after my marriage to notice how deeply he had drained the estate before his death. By the time I inherited the title, the damage was already done. I have spent 3 years trying to repair what he broke, with little success until now." "That must have been difficult," Eleanor said, "managing grief and ruin at once." "It was," he said, and offered nothing more, though the admission itself felt like more than she had expected from him. "I do not discuss it often. I am not certain why I am discussing it with you." "Perhaps because I am your wife now," Eleanor offered gently. "Even a wife of convenience is still permitted to know something of the man she has married." He glanced at her then, a long, searching look that made her feel, for the first time since their meeting in his study, that he was truly seeing her, rather than simply calculating the terms of their arrangement. "Perhaps," he said again, and this time there was the faintest suggestion of warmth beneath the word, gone as quickly as it had come. The townhouse, when they arrived, was as quiet and orderly as Frostmere House had been on her first visit. A small staff greeted them at the door, their expressions carefully neutral, though Eleanor caught more than one curious glance directed her way as she was led to a set of rooms clearly prepared for her arrival. "You will have your own chambers," Julian said, standing in the doorway as a maid unpacked the small trunk of belongings Eleanor had brought with her. "As agreed. I do not expect anything further of you tonight, or any night, beyond what our contract requires in the eyes of the law." "I understand," Eleanor said, though something in his tone made her wonder if he was reassuring her or reminding himself. He lingered a moment longer in the doorway, his gray eyes moving over the room, over her, with an expression she still could not read. "This house has not held a woman's belongings in 3 years, he said finally, his voice quieter than she had yet heard it. "You will forgive the staff if they seem uncertain how to accommodate you properly. They are not accustomed to it." 3 years, Eleanor repeated softly. "Since your first wife." His expression closed instantly, the shutters coming down so fast it was as though she had struck him. "That is not a conversation for tonight," he said, and before she could respond, he had turned and left the room, his footsteps quick and final on the stairs. Eleanor sat alone in the unfamiliar bedroom long after the maid had finished unpacking and left her in peace, staring at the fire the servants had lit in the hearth, the first fire she had seen burning anywhere in either of the Duke's houses. She thought of the flash of grief that had crossed his face at the mere mention of his first wife, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, and she understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that she had not simply married a cold man. She had married a man who was still grieving, whose coldness was not the absence of feeling but a wall built to contain too much of it. She did not know the woman's name yet. She did not know how she had died, or what had happened to leave a house so thoroughly stripped of warmth in her absence. But she knew, sitting there in the flickering firelight of a house that had not held a woman's belongings in 3 years, that whatever waited for her at Frostmere would not be simple, and it would not be easy. 22 days had passed since the will was read. She was married now, the estate secured, Edmund's ambitions thwarted for the moment, but as she finally rose and prepared for bed in a house that was not yet her home, married to a man who was not yet truly her husband in anything but name, Eleanor understood that the real work of this arrangement had only just begun. She thought of her grandfather again, of his gentle hands and his quiet wisdom, and she wondered, staring into the dark, whether he had somehow known that the coldest man in London was not cold at all, only broken in a way that needed patience rather than pity to heal. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it finally did, she dreamed not of her grandfather, nor of Edmund's smug face in the chapel doorway, but of gray eyes watching her from across a room, waiting for something neither of them yet had the words to name. In the morning they would leave for Frostmere, the estate that had earned its master's chosen name, and Eleanor would begin the slow work of learning exactly what kind of man she had bound herself to for the rest of her life. Before dawn broke fully over the rooftops of London, Eleanor rose and stood at her window, watching the servants below already at work preparing the carriage for the journey ahead. She thought of Edmund's face in the chapel doorway, the way his confidence had faltered under Julian's quiet, unshakable authority, and she allowed herself, for the first time since the will was read, a small measure of satisfaction. Whatever else this marriage was, whatever strange and uncertain shape it might take in the months ahead, it had already accomplished what she needed most. Her mother's cottage was secure. The estate remained in Hartwell hands, even if those hands now belonged to a duchess rather than an unmarried woman alone. Edmund's ambitions, for now, had been thoroughly defeated. A soft knock came at her door, and when she opened it, she found not a servant but Julian himself, already dressed for travel, his expression composed once more into the careful neutrality she was beginning to recognize as his default state. "I wish to see that you had everything you required before we depart," he said. "The journey to Frostmere is a long one, and I am told the roads have not improved much since the last rains." "I am ready," Eleanor said, surprised by the small gesture, however practical its explanation. "Thank you for asking." He nodded, his gaze drifting briefly past her to the room beyond, still bare of any personal touches beyond the single trunk she had brought. "It is not much of a life I am offering you," he said quietly, almost as though the words had escaped before he intended to speak them. "A cold house, a distant husband, and debts that will take years to settle properly. I would understand if you found yourself regretting the bargain before we have even reached the estate." "I do not make bargains lightly, Julian," Eleanor said, surprised by her own steadiness, "and I do not regret decisions simply because they prove difficult. I regretted nothing when I signed that contract, and I regret nothing now." Something shifted behind his gray eyes, quick and quiet, gone before she could name it fully. "Then we understand each other," he said, and stepped back to allow her to pass into the hallway ahead of him. They descended the stairs together in silence, and as the carriage pulled away from the townhouse and turned toward the road that would carry them out of London and into the cold, distant countryside of Frostmere, Eleanor allowed herself one final glance back at the city that had shaped her entire life until now. Whatever waited for her at the end of that road, she was determined to face it with the same resolve that had carried her through the reading of the will, through the negotiation in Julian's study, and through the confrontation with Edmund in the chapel doorway. She was a Hartwell still, whatever name the law now gave her, and Hartwells did not retreat from difficult ground. The gates of Frostmere rose out of the fog like the ribs of some great, sleeping animal, iron and stone twisted together in patterns Eleanor could not fully make out through the mist pressing against the carriage windows. "We are close," Julian said, the first words he had spoken in nearly an hour of travel. His voice carried none of the relief she might have expected from a man returning home. If anything, he seemed to sit straighter, his shoulders squared against something Eleanor could not see. The house itself appeared moments later, and Eleanor understood immediately why the estate had earned its name long before Julian ever inherited the title that bore it. Frostmere rose pale and imposing against the gray winter sky, its stone walls untouched by any warmth of color, its many windows dark even in the fading afternoon light, as though the house itself had chosen, deliberately, to keep its eyes closed to the world outside. The staff gathered at the entrance to greet them, a smaller number than Eleanor had expected for an estate of this size, their faces schooled into the same careful neutrality she had noticed in the London servants. An older woman stepped forward first, her gray hair pulled back severely, her dark dress plain and unadorned. "Mrs. Whitmore," Julian said, by way of introduction. "She has managed this household since before I inherited the title. Mrs. Whitmore, this is my wife, the Duchess of Frostmere." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes moved over Eleanor with a swift, assessing glance that reminded her uncomfortably of a merchant weighing goods. "Welcome to Frostmere, Your Grace," she said, though her tone carried more caution than warmth. "I will have your rooms prepared immediately." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and followed the housekeeper inside, Julian trailing a few steps behind, already distracted by a stack of correspondence a footman had handed him the moment he crossed the threshold. The interior of Frostmere matched its exterior in every uncomfortable way. The halls were long and dim, lit sparingly by candles rather than the bright lamps Eleanor was accustomed to in London. Portraits lined some of the walls, their subjects dressed in fashions from decades past, but Eleanor noticed quickly that none of the frames held any recent likeness. No painting of Julian himself. No painting, she suspected, of the woman who had once lived here as his wife. Her own chambers, when she finally reached them, were spacious but sparse, the furniture well-made but old, the fireplace cold and unlit despite the chill already settling into her bones from the journey. "I will have a fire started at once," Mrs. Whitmore said, noticing Eleanor's slight shiver. "His Grace does not often request fires be kept burning throughout the house. He says it wastes the wood needlessly when so few rooms are occupied." "I would appreciate a fire, Mrs. Whitmore," Eleanor said carefully. "In this room, and perhaps in the sitting rooms I might use during the day." The housekeeper's expression flickered with something Eleanor could not quite name, surprise perhaps, or simply the novelty of a request she had not heard in years. "Of course, Your Grace, I will see to it." Over the following days, Eleanor began to understand the shape of the silence that ruled Frostmere. Meals were taken separately more often than not, Julian retreating to his study for hours at a time, emerging only for brief, formal exchanges before disappearing again behind closed doors. The servants moved through the halls like shadows, efficient and quiet, as though they had long ago learned that any unnecessary noise might disturb something fragile in the house's foundations. On her second evening, Eleanor attempted to dine with him in the main hall, a long table set for two that seemed to stretch the distance between them into something absurd. 12 empty chairs, sitting silent on either side. Julian ate quickly, answered her questions about the estate with brief, practical replies, and excused himself before the second course had even been cleared, citing correspondence that could not wait until morning. Eleanor sat alone at the table long after he left, staring at the flickering candles and wondering if she had made a mistake in believing there was anything beneath his coldness worth uncovering. She did not give up easily, though. On the third evening, she moved the smaller table from the sitting room into the study itself, informing a startled Mrs. Whitmore that she intended to take her supper wherever her husband happened to be working, whether he invited her or not. Julian had looked up from his papers with an expression of genuine surprise when the tray arrived, and though he said little as they ate together in the quiet room, Eleanor noticed he did not ask her to leave, and he did not retreat to his correspondence again until the meal was fully finished. It was a small victory, but she counted it as one all the same. Frostmere was not going to soften easily, and neither, she suspected, was its master. But Eleanor Hartwell had never been a woman who backed away from difficult ground, and she did not intend to start now, whatever the cost of patience proved to be. Eleanor was not a woman who accepted silence easily. On her fourth morning at Frostmere, she rose early and made her way to the kitchen before the household had fully woken, startling a young maid who nearly dropped a tray of bread at the sight of the Duchess standing in the doorway. "Forgive me," Eleanor said quickly. "I did not mean to frighten you. I only wished to see the kitchens and perhaps ask for some flowers to be cut from the gardens if there are any still blooming this late in the season." The maid, a young woman named Alice, stared at her with wide eyes before finding her voice. "Flowers, Your Grace? I do not believe anyone has asked for flowers in this house for some years." "Then it is time someone did," Eleanor said, offering a smile that seemed to catch the girl entirely off guard. "Would you show me the gardens? I should like to see them myself." The gardens, when Alice led her out into the cold morning air, told their own quiet story of neglect. Once carefully tended beds now grew wild and overgrown in places, though beneath the tangle, Eleanor could see the bones of what had clearly been a beautiful design, paths curving through what must have once been carefully chosen plantings, a small stone bench positioned beneath a tree that would have offered lovely shade in warmer months. This was her Grace's favorite place, Alice said quietly, then flushed, as though she had said something she should not have. The first Duchess, I mean, before she passed. What was her name? Eleanor asked gently. Margaret, Alice said. Lady Margaret. She used to spend hours out here, even in the cold. His Grace built that bench for her himself, or so the older staff tell it, though I never saw it happen myself. I only came to Frostmere after. Eleanor looked at the small stone bench, weathered now by years of neglect, and felt something tighten in her chest that she could not fully explain. Margaret, the woman whose absence had hollowed out this entire house, whose name Julian had not yet spoken aloud in Eleanor's presence, though his silence spoke of her constantly in everything he did not say. Thank you, Alice, Eleanor said. I think I would like a moment alone here, if you do not mind. The maid curtsied and retreated back toward the house, leaving Eleanor alone in the overgrown garden, with only the cold wind and the ghost of a woman she had never met. She was still there an hour later, having pulled weeds away from the base of the stone bench with her bare hands despite the cold, when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Julian standing at the edge of the garden, watching her with an expression she could not read. What are you doing? He asked, his voice quieter than she expected, none of the sharp authority she had heard him use with Edmund in the chapel. Alice told me this was Margaret's garden, Eleanor said, straightening slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. I thought it deserved better than to be left like this. Something crossed Julian's face then, quick and raw, gone almost before Eleanor could name it. For a moment, she thought he might turn and walk away, retreat back into the house and the silence that had clearly served as his armor for 3 long years. Instead, he walked closer, his gaze moving over the small progress she had already made, the cleared space around the base of the bench, the weeds pulled and set aside. She planted the roses along that far wall herself, he said finally, his voice low. I have not been able to look at them properly since she died. I told the gardeners to leave this section alone, to let it grow wild if it wished. I could not bear to see anyone else tending what she had built. I am sorry, Eleanor said softly. I did not mean to intrude on something so private. You did not intrude, Julian said, surprising her. I think, perhaps, someone needed to. I have simply been unable to be that someone. They stood together in silence for a long moment, the wind moving through the bare branches above them, and Eleanor found herself studying his profile, the tight set of his jaw, the distant look in his gray eyes that seemed fixed on some memory she could not see. What happened to her? Eleanor asked gently, if you are willing to tell me. Julian was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might refuse the question entirely, retreat back into the silence that had governed this house for 3 years. But finally he spoke, his voice low and careful, as though each word cost him something significant to release. A fever, he said. It came on quickly, in the winter. 3 years passed. The physicians could do nothing. I was away in London when it worsened, attending to business I believed at the time was more urgent than staying at her side. By the time I returned, she was already gone. He paused, his hands clenching briefly at his sides before he forced them still again. I have not forgiven myself for that absence. I do not expect I ever will. Eleanor did not know what to say to that, did not know if there were words adequate to the grief carved so deeply into a man who had spent 3 years building walls of ice around a wound that had never properly healed. So instead, she simply reached out and touched his arm, a small gesture, careful and light. You could not have known, she said. Grief does not listen to reason, Julian, but that does not make the guilt fair. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, something in his expression shifting in a way she had not seen before. Something that looked almost like surprise at finding comfort where he had expected only distance. Thank you, he said quietly, for asking. And for not looking at me with pity, as everyone else has these past 3 years. I do not pity you, Eleanor said honestly. I understand loss. My grandfather's death is still fresh enough that I feel it every morning I wake in a world without him in it. Grief is not something to be pitied. It is simply something to be carried. Julian studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor thought, for the first time since she had walked into his study a week ago, that she was truly seeing past the ice to something warmer buried beneath it, something patient and wounded, and not yet entirely lost. Would you like help finishing this? He asked finally, gesturing toward the tangled garden around them. It has been neglected long enough. Eleanor smiled. Genuinely this time. I would like that very much. They worked together in the cold afternoon light until the sun began to set, clearing weeds and overgrown branches from Margaret's garden in a silence that no longer felt heavy, but companionable. Two people slowly learning how to exist in the same space without needing to fill every quiet moment with words. It was not love. Eleanor knew that. It was too soon, too strange a beginning for anything so grand a word. But it was something, a small crack of warmth finding its way through walls that had stood frozen for 3 long years. And Eleanor found herself, for the first time since the will was read, genuinely curious about the man she had married, rather than simply grateful for the bargain he had agreed to. 19 days remained before the 30-day deadline would have expired, though the marriage itself had already secured everything the will required. But as Eleanor walked back toward the house beside her husband that evening, the cold air sharp in her lungs and the first hint of real conversation finally passing between them, she understood that whatever came next between them would matter far more than any deadline the will had ever set. The letter arrived at Frostmere on a morning bright with unexpected sun, and it took only a single line for Eleanor's stomach to drop straight through the floor. Edmund has filed a petition to contest the marriage, Mr. Pruitt had written, his usually careful handwriting hurried and cramped across the page. He claims the union was arranged solely to circumvent the terms of your grandfather's will, and that no genuine marriage exists between you and the Duke. A hearing has been scheduled for the end of the month. I urge you to come to London immediately. Eleanor read the letter 3 times at the breakfast table before she trusted herself to speak, and by the time Julian entered the room moments later, drawn by the sound of her sharp intake of breath, she had already gone pale. "What is it?" he asked, crossing the room quickly, his usual composure cracking with genuine concern. She handed him the letter without a word, watching his expression shift as he read, the careful blankness he wore so often hardening into something colder and far more dangerous than she had yet seen from him. "He means to take everything from you after all," Julian said quietly, setting the letter down with deliberate care, as though he did not trust himself to hold it without crushing it in his fist. Even after losing the first battle, he searches for another way to win the war. "He is not entirely wrong," Eleanor said, forcing herself to speak the uncomfortable truth aloud. "We did marry for the estate, Julian. For your debts and my inheritance. If Edmund can prove that in front of a court, if he can show there was no true intention behind our vows, the will's condition may not be satisfied in the eyes of the law." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath, uncertain what conclusion he had reached in the silence. "Then we shall have to prove him wrong," he said finally. "How?" "A contract exists, Julian. Terms were negotiated. Any solicitor worth his fee could find that document and use it as evidence against us. Contracts are not the whole of a marriage," Julian said, and something in his voice made Eleanor look up sharply. "Whatever began between us as an arrangement has not remained only that, Eleanor. I do not believe it has, in any case. I do not intend to lie to a court about what has grown here, whatever shape it takes." Eleanor's heart caught in her throat at his words, though there was no time to examine them properly, not with a hearing looming and her cousin's ambition sharpened once more into a weapon aimed directly at everything she had fought to protect. They departed for London within the day, the journey passing in tense, anxious silence broken only occasionally by discussions of strategy, of which witnesses might speak to the truth of their marriage, of how Mr. Pruitt intended to counter whatever evidence Edmund's solicitors had gathered against them. Mr. Pruitt met them at the townhouse the following morning, his usual calm demeanor strained by the seriousness of the situation. He spread a fresh set of papers across the table, his expression grim as he explained the full scope of Edmund's petition. "He has gathered statements from several members of society who witnessed the haste of your courtship, or rather, the absence of one," Mr. Pruitt said. "He intends to argue that no reasonable observer could conclude this marriage was anything but a transaction. I will not lie to you, Your Grace, Miss Hartwell. This is a more serious challenge than I initially believed it would be." "What do we need?" Julian asked, his voice sharp with focus rather than fear. "Witnesses who have observed you together since the marriage," Mr. Pruitt said. "Servants, if they are willing to speak honestly. Anyone who can testify to a change, however small, in how the two of you conduct yourselves toward one another. The court cares little for how a marriage begins, my lord, but it cares a great deal about what a marriage has become." Mrs. Whitmore, who had traveled with them from Frostmere at Eleanor's request, stepped forward from where she had been waiting near the door, her expression uncharacteristically soft. "I would be glad to speak, if it would help, Your Grace," she said. addressing Julian directly. I have managed this household through more than one kind of winter, if you will forgive me saying so. I know the difference between a house that is merely occupied and a house that has begun, again, to live. Julian looked at his housekeeper with genuine surprise, and something in his expression softened at her words in a way Eleanor had rarely seen. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. That would help a great deal. Alice, too, offered to speak of the garden, of the flowers that had returned to the kitchen table each week since Eleanor's arrival, of the fire that now burned steadily in rooms that had stood cold and dark for 3 long years. Eleanor found herself unexpectedly moved by the willingness of the household staff to stand before a judge on her behalf, people who owed her nothing beyond the ordinary courtesy of their positions, and yet had clearly noticed, in their quiet way, the change spreading slowly through Frostmere's halls. That evening, as Mr. Pruitt gathered his papers and prepared to leave, Julian walked Eleanor out into the small garden behind the townhouse, the two of them standing together beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain. Are you frightened? He asked quietly. Yes, Eleanor admitted. Not simply of losing the estate, Julian, of what it would mean to have a court declare that what has grown between us is not real. It is real, he said, with a certainty that steadied something anxious in her chest. Whatever the judge decides, Eleanor, I know what I have come to feel in these past weeks. No ruling can take that from me, whatever else it might cost us. She looked up at him in the fading evening light, searching his face for the walls that had once seemed so impossible to breach, and found, instead, only quiet honesty staring back at her. The hearing, when it finally arrived 2 weeks later, was held in a small, formal chamber before a judge whose expression gave away nothing of his opinion as the proceedings began. Edmund sat across the room with his own solicitor, a thin, sharp-featured man who rose first to present his case with the confident air of someone who believed he had already won. My lord, the solicitor began, addressing the judge with practiced ease. The marriage in question was arranged with unusual haste, mere days after the reading of a will that made explicit financial demands upon Miss Hartwell. We submit as evidence a contract, drawn between the parties before the marriage took place, detailing financial terms with no mention whatsoever of affection, courtship, or any of the customary considerations that typically precede a genuine union. We submit that this marriage exists in name only, arranged for the sole purpose of satisfying the will's condition, and that the true spirit of that condition, which surely intended for Miss Hartwell to find genuine protection and partnership, has not been honored. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap beneath the table as the contract was presented and read aloud, every cold clause exposed before the judge's careful, unreadable gaze. She glanced at Julian beside her, expecting to see the same tension gripping his features, but instead found him watching Edmund's solicitor with an expression of calm, focused patience, as though he had already anticipated every word being spoken. When Mr. Pruitt rose to respond, he did not immediately dispute the contract's existence. Instead, he called Julian to speak on his own behalf, a decision that made Eleanor's breath catch, uncertain what her husband intended to say. Julian rose slowly and faced the judge directly, his voice steady and clear in a way that filled the small chamber with an authority that needed no volume to command attention. My lord, I will not deny that a contract exists, he began. I will not deny that our marriage began as an arrangement between two people facing separate, pressing difficulties. But I would ask the court to consider that many marriages of far greater social standing begin with far less honesty than mine did with my wife. We were plain with each other from the first conversation. We did not pretend affection we did not yet feel. And in the weeks since our marriage, my lord, that honesty has grown into something the contract never once required of either of us. He paused, and Eleanor saw, for the briefest moment, something raw pass across his face before he mastered it again. I lost my first wife 3 years ago, my lord, and I have spent every day since believing myself incapable of feeling anything beyond grief and duty. I entered this marriage believing the same would remain true, that I would offer my name and my resources in exchange for what I needed, and expect nothing further from either of us. I was wrong. My wife has done what I believed impossible. She has brought warmth back into a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like. She tends a garden that belonged to a woman I loved and lost, not out of obligation, but because she understood, without being told, that some griefs need tending rather than avoidance. I do not know what to call what exists between us now, my lord, whether the court would recognize it as love in the fullest sense the word deserves. But I know it is not nothing. I know it is not the empty arrangement my wife's cousin wishes this court to believe it is. The chamber had gone entirely silent, and Eleanor felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes that she fought desperately to hold back, aware of every eye in the room now turned toward her. Edmund's solicitor rose again, attempting to press the point about the contract's cold, transactional language, but the judge raised a hand to silence him before he could finish his objection. "I have heard enough on the matter of the contract," the judge said. "Contracts describe terms, not hearts. I have presided over marriages built on nothing but land and title that have lasted 40 years in cold silence, and I have seen marriages that began in genuine love collapse within months. The question before this court is not whether affection existed at the moment of signing, but whether a genuine marriage exists now, in fact and in practice." He turned his attention to Eleanor. "Your Grace, do you have anything to add before I render my judgment?" Eleanor rose on unsteady legs, aware of Edmund's furious glare fixed on her from across the room, aware of Julian's steady presence beside her, and found, to her own surprise, that the words came easily once she began to speak. "My lord, my grandfather wrote his will, believing a woman alone could not hold this estate against pressure from those who wished to take it from her. I do not believe he intended for me to find love within 30 days of his death. I believe he intended for me to find safety and partnership and the chance to build something honest out of difficult circumstances. That is precisely what I have found in my husband. Whatever this marriage began as, my lord, I do not wish to end it, and I do not believe the law should force me to, simply because the truth of it grew slowly, rather than arriving fully formed on our wedding day." The judge studied them both for a long moment before finally speaking. "The petition to contest the marriage is denied. I find no evidence of fraud or coercion sufficient to invalidate a legally conducted union, and I find, based on the testimony presented today, a marriage that exists in genuine practice, whatever its origins. Mr. Hartwell's claim to the estate is dismissed in full." Edmund's face went white with fury as the judge's gavel struck, and he rose from his seat without a word, his earlier confidence entirely stripped away, replaced by the hollow anger of a man who had gambled everything on a final desperate move, and lost. He left the chamber without looking back, his solicitor hurrying after him, and Eleanor watched him go with a strange, quiet sense of finality rather than triumph. It was over. Truly over. In a way the marriage itself had not quite managed to feel until this moment. Outside the courthouse, in the cool afternoon air, Eleanor turned to Julian, still trying to steady her racing heart. "You did not have to say all of that in there," she said softly. "The contract alone might have been enough to satisfy the judge, given the marriage was legally conducted." "I did not say it only for the judge," Julian said, his gray eyes fixed on hers with an intensity she had not seen from him before, not even in the garden weeks earlier. "I said it because it was true, Eleanor. Every word of it." Her breath caught. "Julian, I did not expect to feel anything again," he continued, his voice low and unsteady in a way that felt far more honest than any composed speech he had given inside the chamber. "I built this house into a fortress against feeling anything, and I told myself I preferred it that way. And then you walked into my study with a contract and a deadline, and somehow, without my permission, without my understanding how it happened, you found your way past every wall I had built." Eleanor felt tears finally spill freely down her cheeks, no longer able to hold them back. "I did not expect it either," she admitted. "I came to you for a bargain, Julian. I did not expect to fall in love with the terms of it." He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with a gentleness that startled her, his hand lingering against her face longer than the gesture required. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "your grandfather's will was wiser than either of us gave it credit for." They stood together outside the courthouse for a long moment, the noise of London carrying on around them, indifferent to the quiet, private revelation passing between two people who had begun as strangers, bound by necessity, and had somehow, against every expectation, found something neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding again. The estate was secure. Edmund's threat was finally, truly ended. And for the first time since the reading of the will, Eleanor felt no fear at all about what waited for her next, only a quiet, steady certainty that whatever came, she would not be facing it alone. Mr. Pruitt joined them on the courthouse steps a few minutes later, his usual composure broken by a wide, relieved smile, as he shook Julian's hand firmly. "A remarkable outcome, Your Grace. I confess I feared the contract alone might sink us before we had the chance to argue anything further." "It was never the contract that would win this," Julian said, glancing at Eleanor with a warmth that had not existed in his eyes when she first walked into his study weeks ago. "It was everything that came after it." Mr. Pruitt nodded, gathering his papers with brisk efficiency. "I will see that the necessary documents are filed to close the matter permanently. Mr. Hartwell will have no further grounds to contest the will, now or in the future. You may consider this chapter fully closed, Your Grace, Miss Hartwell." He paused, correcting himself with a small, pleased smile. "Forgive me, Your Grace Duchess. I suppose old habits take time to catch up with new realities." "There is no need to apologize, Mr. Pruitt," Eleanor said, laughing softly despite the exhaustion still weighing on her shoulders. "I am still catching up with the new reality myself." As Mr. Pruitt took his leave, promising to send word once the final papers were filed, Julian offered Eleanor his arm, and she took it without hesitation, the simple gesture feeling far more natural now than it had on the day of their wedding. They walked together toward the waiting carriage, leaving behind the courthouse and the last remnants of Edmund's ambition, and Eleanor found herself thinking, not of the will or the deadline or the desperate bargain that had brought them together, but simply of the road ahead of them, and the strange, unexpected gift that had grown out of 30 days meant only to secure an inheritance. The carriage had barely cleared the edge of London before Julian spoke again, his voice quieter now that the formality of the courthouse had fallen away behind them. "There is something I have not told you," he said, his gaze fixed on his own hands rather than on her. "Something about Margaret that I have carried alone for 3 years, and I find I no longer wish to carry it alone." Eleanor turned to face him fully, sensing the weight behind his words. "You do not have to tell me anything you are not ready to share, Julian." "I am ready," he said, and though his voice remained steady, she could see the effort it cost him. "The night she fell ill, we had quarreled. It was foolish, in hindsight, a disagreement over nothing more significant than a dinner party I did not wish to attend. I left for London the following morning, still angry, still certain I had been right to leave rather than stay and resolve things properly between us. I did not know, when I climbed into that carriage, that I would never speak to her again while she was well enough to understand my words." Eleanor reached for his hand, holding it gently between both of hers, saying nothing, sensing he needed the space to finish what he had started. "By the time word reached me that she had fallen ill, the fever had already taken hold badly. I returned as quickly as the roads allowed, but she was already fading by the time I arrived, barely able to recognize me. I never had the chance to tell her I was sorry for the quarrel, sorry for leaving in anger rather than staying to make things right. I have carried that unfinished apology for 3 years, Eleanor, and I built this entire house into a fortress rather than face how much it haunted me." "Oh, Julian," Eleanor said softly, her heart aching for the young man who had carried such guilt alone through years of silence and cold, empty rooms. She would not have wanted you to spend 3 years punishing yourself for a quarrel that every married couple experiences at some point. Disagreements are not betrayals. They are simply proof that two people care enough to argue about what matters to them." "I know that, in my mind," Julian said. "But grief does not always listen to reason, as you told me once yourself, in the garden." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It does not. But perhaps it listens, eventually, to patience, and to someone willing to sit with you in it, rather than asking you to simply move past it before you are ready." Julian looked at her then with an expression she had never seen from him before, something unguarded and raw and entirely without the careful composure he had worn like armor since the day they met. "You have given me more patience in these past weeks than I believe I deserved, Eleanor. I did not marry you expecting kindness. I expected a transaction, cold and practical, exactly as I told you it would be that first day in my study." "And instead?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer, hoped for it, with a hope she had not fully allowed herself to name until this moment. "Instead, I found a woman brave enough to walk into a stranger's house and negotiate for her own future, who then turned that same courage toward mending a garden that belonged to a woman she had never met, simply because she understood that some griefs deserve tending rather than avoidance. I found a woman who defended this marriage before a judge not because a contract required it of her, but because she believed, as I have come to believe, that what grew between us in these past weeks was worth defending." He paused, his hand tightening gently around hers. "I love you, Eleanor. I did not expect to say those words again in this lifetime, and yet here I am, saying them to you, and meaning every syllable." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, though this time they came from happiness rather than grief or fear. "I love you too, Julian," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of finally admitting what she had felt growing in her chest for weeks now. Quiet and patient, blooming slowly the way Margaret's roses would bloom again come spring, tended now rather than abandoned. "I did not expect it either. I came to you with a contract and a deadline, and somehow I found something far more valuable than either." He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and when she did not, he kissed her gently, the carriage rattling along the road beneath them, the cold London afternoon forgotten entirely in the warmth finally passing between two people who had spent weeks circling closer to this moment, without either of them fully realizing it. When they finally arrived back at Frostmere 2 days later, the estate looked different to Eleanor's eyes, though nothing about the stone walls or the pale winter sky had truly changed. It was the same house that had greeted her with such cold formality weeks earlier, and yet it felt, now, like something closer to a home. Mrs. Whitmore greeted them at the door with visible relief, having received word of the judgment through a letter sent ahead of their return. "Welcome home, your graces," she said, and Eleanor noticed the genuine warmth in the housekeeper's voice, so different from the cautious neutrality of their first meeting weeks earlier. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," Julian said, "for everything. I do not believe I have properly thanked the staff for their loyalty through this entire ordeal." "There is no need for thanks, your grace," Mrs. Whitmore said, though her eyes softened at the sentiment behind his words. "It has been a pleasure to see this house come back to life. We had nearly given up hope of it, if I am honest." Inside, Julian led her not to the study, as had become their habit in the early days of the marriage, but to a room she had never seen before, tucked at the end of a hallway on the upper floor, its door kept firmly closed since her arrival at Frostmere. "I have not opened this room in 3 years," he said, his hand resting on the door handle, hesitation clear in the tightness of his shoulders. "It was Margaret's sitting room. I could not bear to enter it after she passed, and I instructed the staff to leave it exactly as it was." "You do not have to show me this," Eleanor said gently, sensing the weight of what he was offering her. "I want to," Julian said, and opened the door. The room beyond was smaller than Eleanor expected, warm even in its dust and disuse, filled with the particular clutter of a life once fully lived. Books lay open on a small writing desk, as though their reader had simply stepped away for a moment rather than 3 long years. A shawl hung over the back of a chair near the window, and Eleanor could see, in the careful arrangement of dried flowers still sitting in a vase upon the mantel, the same quiet love of growing things that had shaped the garden below. She loved this room, Julian said quietly, standing in the doorway as though still hesitant to fully enter. She used to read here in the mornings, before the household woke. I would find her here sometimes, entirely lost in whatever book had caught her attention that week, and I would simply stand in the doorway and watch her, too content with the sight to interrupt it. Eleanor moved carefully into the room, touching nothing, simply absorbing the quiet evidence of a life that had once filled these walls with warmth before grief had sealed them shut. "Thank you for showing me," she said softly. "I think I understand her a little better now, seeing this." "I do not wish to erase her," Julian said, finally stepping fully into the room beside her. "I do not think loving you requires forgetting her, Eleanor. I have come to believe, these past weeks, that a heart can hold more than one love, without either one diminishing the other." "I would never ask you to forget her," Eleanor said. "I only hope, in time, that this room might become something other than a shrine to grief. Perhaps it could simply become a room again, one filled with whatever new memories we choose to build inside it." Julian looked around the room slowly, as though seeing it with fresh eyes for the first time in 3 years. "I think I would like that," he said finally. "I think Margaret would have liked that as well. She was never a woman who believed in dwelling too long on sorrow, when there was still living left to do." They left the room together that evening, the door left open behind them for the first time in 3 years, and Eleanor felt, walking back down the hallway beside her husband, that something significant had shifted in the foundation of the house itself, some old grief finally allowed to breathe after years of being sealed away in silence. That evening, Julian led Eleanor out to the garden once more, now fully cleared of the weeds and neglect that had claimed it for 3 long years. In the fading light, she could see the roses along the far wall, still bare with winter but clearly alive beneath the surface, waiting patiently for spring to call them back into bloom. "I have been thinking," Julian said, standing beside the stone bench he had built for Margaret so many years ago, "that this garden should not belong only to the past. Margaret loved it because it gave her peace, a place to simply exist without the weight of the house pressing in around her. I think she would want it to continue serving that purpose, for whoever tends it next." Eleanor understood what he was offering her, not simply a garden, but a place in the story of this house that did not require her to replace the woman who came before her, only to continue what she had begun, in her own way, at her own pace. "I would like that," Eleanor said softly. "I would like to plant something of my own here too, alongside what she started, not to replace her memory, Julian, simply to add to it." "I think," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide from her, "that is exactly what Margaret would have wanted. She was never a woman who believed love needed to be limited to only one chapter of a life. She would have wanted this house to live again, whatever shape that living took. They stood together in the garden as the last light faded from the sky, the cold air no longer feeling quite so bitter with Julian's hand wrapped around hers, and Eleanor thought of her grandfather once more, of the strange, impossible will he had left behind, the 30-day deadline that had felt, at the time, like the cruelest test he could have devised. She understood now, standing in a garden slowly returning to life beside a man who had done the same, that her grandfather had not written a punishment into that will at all. He had written a chance, however strange its shape, however unlikely its odds. He had trusted her to find her own way through an impossible situation, and somehow, against every expectation either of them could have held, she had found not just safety and security, but a genuine partnership built first on honesty and grown, slowly and patiently, into love. In the weeks that followed, Frostmere continued its quiet transformation. Fires burned steadily in rooms that had stood cold for years. Flowers appeared regularly on the tables, cut fresh from the garden Eleanor tended alongside Julian in the early mornings before the household fully woke. Meals were taken together now, not out of obligation but out of genuine preference, conversations stretching long past the final course, as they learned, day by day, the small details of each other's lives that a contract could never have captured. Edmund did not trouble them again. Word reached them eventually that he had left London entirely, his reputation too damaged by the failed petition to maintain his usual standing among society, and Eleanor found she felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that the matter was fully behind her. Charlotte visited often, delighted to find her daughter settled not merely into safety, but into genuine happiness, and she wept openly the first time she saw Julian laugh freely at something Eleanor had said over dinner, a sound Mrs. Whitmore later confessed she had not heard echo through Frostmere's halls in more than 3 years. Eleanor thought, sometimes, of that first meeting in Julian's cold study, of the careful, transactional language they had both used to describe an arrangement neither of them believed could ever become anything more. She thought of the 30-day deadline that had once felt like the cruelest trap her grandfather could have devised, and she smiled now at the memory, understanding fully what she had not been able to see at the time. Her grandfather had given her 30 days to find a marriage that would secure her future. He could not have known, could not have planned for the fact that she would find, within those same 30 days, something far more valuable than mere security. She had found a man willing to rebuild himself, patiently and honestly, in front of her. She had found a home willing to remember warmth. And she had found, in the coldest man London had ever whispered about, a heart that had simply been waiting, all along, for someone patient enough to help it thaw. The deadline had come and gone weeks ago now, its urgency long forgotten in the slower, steadier rhythm of the life they were building together. But Eleanor still remembered, some mornings, standing on the solicitor's steps with her mother's tears and her cousin's cruel smile, believing herself trapped by an impossible choice. She had not been trapped at all. She had simply been given, in the strangest and coldest possible way, exactly the chance her grandfather always believed she deserved. On the morning the first roses finally bloomed along the far wall of the garden, Eleanor woke early and made her way outside alone, wanting to see them before anyone else in the household stirred. The scent reached her before the sight did, sweet and unmistakable against the cool spring air, and she stood for a long moment simply admiring the color returning to a place that had known only gray neglect for so many years. "They are beautiful," Julian said from behind her, and Eleanor turned to find him standing in the doorway, still in his dressing gown, watching her with the same quiet warmth that had become as familiar to her now as the sound of his voice. "Margaret chose well," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the blooms. "These would have been beautiful in any garden in London, and yet she planted them here, where only she and whoever loved her would ever truly see them." "I think that was rather the point," Julian said, coming to stand beside her. She never cared much for showing things off to society. She simply wanted beauty that belonged to her, quietly, without needing anyone else's approval to make it real. Eleanor smiled, understanding the sentiment more fully now than she might have weeks earlier, before Frostmere had taught her its own quiet lessons about the value of things built slowly and privately, away from the noise and judgment of London's endless gossip. "I planted something too, further along the wall. It will not bloom for another few weeks yet, but I thought the garden should have something new growing alongside what she started." Julian looked at her with an expression of such open affection that Eleanor felt her breath catch slightly, still not fully accustomed to the warmth that had replaced his old careful distance. "Show me," he said, and she led him along the garden path to the small patch of freshly turned earth where she had planted bulbs weeks earlier, patiently waiting for their own season to arrive. I do not yet know what color they will be, Eleanor admitted. The gardener who sold them to me could not say for certain, only that they would bloom sometime in early summer. Then we shall simply have to wait and see together, Julian said, taking her hand in his. I find these days that I do not mind waiting for things nearly as much as I once did. They stood together in the garden as the morning sun climbed higher over Frostmere's pale stone walls, the roses swaying gently in the breeze beside the quiet promise of whatever Eleanor's own planting would eventually reveal. It was, Eleanor thought, a fitting image for everything that had grown between them, since that first cold meeting in Julian's study. Two separate plantings, different in origin and uncertain in their final shape, growing now side by side in the same soil, tended by the same patient hands, blooming in their own time, rather than any deadline a will or a court could ever have imposed upon them. 30 days had once felt like a cruel and impossible sentence. Looking back now, from the quiet safety of a garden slowly returning to life, Eleanor understood it instead as the beginning of the truest and most unexpected gift her grandfather could ever have left her. Not an inheritance of land or money, but the chance to build something honest, patient, and entirely her own, beside a man who had needed, just as much as she had, someone brave enough to knock on a frozen door and wait for it to open. A year had passed since the reading of the will, and Frostmere no longer resembled the cold, silent house Eleanor had first entered, as a nervous bride bound by contract rather than affection. The change had come slowly, the way most real change does, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small, deliberate choices repeated day after day, until they became simply the way things were. Fires burned in every occupied room now, not sparingly rationed as they had once been, but kept steady through the cold months as a matter of course. The halls that had once echoed with careful, muffled footsteps now carried laughter more often than silence, servants no longer schooling their faces into careful neutrality, but greeting their Duke and Duchess with genuine warmth as they passed through the corridors on their daily business. Eleanor stood now in the garden that had become, over the past year, entirely her own project as much as it remained a tribute to the woman who had planted its first roses. The bulbs she had planted that first spring had bloomed into a cheerful patch of yellow and white flowers along the far wall, thriving alongside Margaret's roses in a combination that somehow felt exactly right. Two different seasons of love growing together rather than competing for the same ground. You are out here early again, Julian said, joining her as the morning mist still clung to the grass, a cup of tea in each hand as had become his habit these past months. He passed one to her and settled onto the stone bench beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. I could not sleep, Eleanor admitted, accepting the tea gratefully. I kept thinking of everything that has changed since I first arrived here, frightened and uncertain what kind of man I had bound myself to for the rest of my life. Julian smiled, the expression coming far more easily to him now than it once had. And what conclusion did you reach in all that thinking? That I am grateful, every single day, that my grandfather wrote such a strange and impossible will, Eleanor said. I used to resent it, in those first frightening days. Now I cannot imagine my life having taken any other path. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun climb slowly over the garden walls, before Julian spoke again, his voice carrying a note of careful excitement he did not often allow himself to show. I received a letter yesterday from Mrs. Whitmore's nephew, the one training as an architect in London. He has drawn up plans for the East Wing, exactly as we discussed. New windows, larger and brighter, and a proper nursery, should we ever have need of one. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at the mention, remembering their earlier conversation on the subject, so different now from the careful, guarded exchange they had shared in his study on the very first day they met, when he had asked her not to press him further about children. Time and trust had changed that guarded silence into something far more hopeful. I would like to see those plans, she said softly. I think it is time this house grew a little more, do you not agree? Julian took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles, and Eleanor did not miss the slight tremor of emotion beneath his composed exterior. I agree completely, he said. I never believed I would want this again, Eleanor. A family, a future built on something other than grief and duty. You gave that back to me, whether you intended to or not, when you walked into my study with a contract and a deadline neither of us expected to end anywhere close to this. We built it together, Eleanor corrected gently. I did not do this alone, Julian. You met me halfway at every turn, even when it clearly frightened you to do so. He laughed softly at that, a sound Eleanor still treasured every time she heard it, knowing how rare it had once been within these walls. I suppose we did, though I confess I spent the first several weeks convinced I was simply fulfilling the terms of a contract rather than falling in love with my own wife. "When did you know?" Eleanor asked, curious, despite having heard fragments of the answer before, wanting to hear it again in the peaceful quiet of the garden they had built together. Julian considered the question seriously, as he considered most things, turning it over carefully before answering. "The day I found you pulling weeds from around Margaret's bench with your bare hands, uncaring of the cold or the dirt, simply because you believed the garden deserved better than neglect. I think some part of me understood, even then, that you were the same about people as you were about gardens. You did not walk away from difficult, neglected things. You tended them, patiently, until they remembered how to grow again." Eleanor felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, though they came easily now, no longer the anxious tears of a frightened bride but the softer tears of a woman fully content with the life she had built. "I think I fell in love with you the day you defended me against Edmund in the chapel," she admitted. "I did not expect such fierce protection from a man everyone in London called cold and unfeeling. I understood, in that moment, that whatever ice had settled over your heart, it had not touched the core of who you truly were." They sat together as the morning fully arrived, the mist burning away under the strengthening sun, the garden around them alive with color and quiet, growing things, exactly as Julian had once promised it would become again. Later that week, a letter arrived from Charlotte, full of warm news from London and gentle inquiries about when her daughter might next visit, along with a small, teasing postscript wondering aloud whether Frostmere might soon have need of a nursery of its own. Eleanor smiled reading it, folding the letter carefully to share with Julian that evening, another small thread connecting the family she had feared losing entirely, only a year ago, to the new family she and Julian were slowly building together. Edmund's name rarely surfaced anymore, his failed petition and subsequent departure from London society having faded into little more than a distant, unpleasant memory. Occasionally, word reached them of his diminished circumstances in some distant county, but Eleanor found she no longer felt any need to dwell on his fate. Whatever bitterness he carried was his own burden now, entirely separate from the life she had built far beyond his reach. Mrs. Whitmore, too, had softened considerably over the year, the careful caution of their first meeting long replaced by genuine fondness. She took particular pride now in overseeing the small renovations to the east wing, often consulting Eleanor on details of color and fabric with an enthusiasm that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those first quiet, guarded weeks at Frostmere. "The nursery windows will face the garden, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitmore explained one afternoon, spreading the architect's drawings across the study table for Eleanor's approval, so that whoever sleeps there might wake each morning to the very same roses you have tended so faithfully this past year. "That is a lovely thought, Mrs. Whitmore," Eleanor said, studying the drawings with quiet delight. "Thank you for thinking of it." "It was His Grace's idea, in truth," Mrs. Whitmore admitted, a small, knowing smile crossing her usually composed features, "though I suspect he would deny it if you asked him directly. He has grown rather sentimental this past year, if you will permit me to say so, Your Grace. It is a welcome change from the man I served before your arrival." Eleanor smiled at that, unsurprised by the observation, having witnessed the same quiet transformation firsthand in 100 small moments the housekeeper likely never saw. Alice, too, had grown from a nervous young maid startled by an unexpected visit to the kitchens into a confident young woman who now oversaw the cutting and arranging of fresh flowers throughout the house each week, a task she approached with obvious pride and care. The household itself had grown gradually over the year as well, new staff hired as the estate's finances steadily improved under the careful management Julian and Eleanor now handled together, poring over ledgers in the evenings with a partnership that would have seemed impossible to either of them during that first cold negotiation in his study. The shipping interests Eleanor had brought to the marriage had flourished under attentive management, the profits slowly clearing away the debts that had once threatened to consume the entire estate, until Frostmere stood now on genuinely solid ground for the first time in years. As autumn approached once more, marking a full year since the frightening reading of her grandfather's will, Eleanor found herself standing again beside the stone bench in Margaret's garden, now equally her own, watching the last of the summer flowers fade as the roses prepared for their winter rest. Julian joined her there, as he did most evenings now, and together they watched the sun set slowly behind Frostmere's pale stone walls, the house no longer cold or silent behind them, but warm and alive with the quiet, patient love two people had built together, one honest conversation and one small kindness at a time. The 30 days her grandfather's will had once demanded felt impossibly distant now, a memory belonging almost to different people entirely, Strangers negotiating terms across a cold study with no notion of what their arrangement might eventually become. Eleanor no longer thought of herself as the desperate woman who had walked into that room seeking only safety and security. She was simply Eleanor now, Duchess of Frostmere, standing beside the man she loved in a garden that bloomed a little more fully each passing year, grateful beyond measure for a will that had demanded the impossible and delivered, instead, exactly what her heart had always needed without knowing it.